At 4 in the morning on October 20th, 1926, a man named Ed Fletcher climbed into a Cadillac in San Diego, California, and pointed it the wrong way. Los Angeles was up the coast. Everybody who mattered was headed for Los Angeles. Fletcher turned his back on it and drove the other direction, east into the dark, toward the mountains, and past the mountains, the desert, and past the desert, most of a continent he meant to cross without ever really stopping. He wasn't driving to Phoenix. He wasn't driving to Texas. He was driving to Savannah, Georgia, the other ocean, 2,500 miles the other way, on the far side of the country, where the land finally gives out into the Atlantic. The car already had 17,000 miles on it. Riding with him were his son, Ed Jr., a mechanic named Graves, and a couple of other men who could take the wheel in shifts, so the Cadillac almost never had to stop. Fletcher had planned the whole thing like a military campaign. He'd wired ahead to towns down the route. He had local police ready to wave him through. He had a schedule worked out to the hour, and the schedule said this was possible, and almost nobody believed him. Because in 1926, you did not simply drive across the United States, not on a whim, and not fast. The country underneath the car wasn't built for it yet, and the southern way Fletcher was taking, San Diego to Savannah, was the hardest version of an already hard idea. It went wrong almost right away. A cloudburst tore through Arizona and washed the road out from under him, bridges and all. He detoured, lost hours, and came to the San Pedro River with no way across, so he had 4 horses hitched to the front of that Cadillac to drag 2,000 pounds of automobile down through the water and up the far bank. Then he got back in and kept driving. By the time he reached Dallas, he'd been going a full day, and there was a crowd standing in the street waiting for him. In Shreveport, it was past 1 in the morning, and 300 people were still up to watch a dust-caked Cadillac roll through town and not stop. Out in the Louisiana dark, one of the drivers fell asleep at the wheel, and the car drifted off toward the swamp, and Ed Jr. grabbed the wheel out of the man's hands and hauled it back onto the road. The last stretch into Georgia was red clay. If the rain that was hanging over them had actually come down, that clay would have turned to grease, and grease would have been the end of it. The rain held off. At 3:15 in the morning on October 23rd, the Cadillac rolled into Savannah with the Atlantic Ocean in front of it. 2,535 miles, 71 hours and 15 minutes. He had beaten the fastest anybody had ever crossed the country by car by almost 12 hours. He had beaten the fastest passenger train on the same trip by more than a day. And you have never heard of him. You've never heard of Ed Fletcher. You've probably never heard of the road he just proved you could drive. But here's the strange part, the part this whole story is really about. You have absolutely heard of its twin. Because less than 3 weeks after Fletcher's run, a different road, a few states to the north of his, got a number 2. In fact, it got its number on the exact same day Fletcher's road got its own. And that other road eventually got a song. It got a nickname, the Mother Road. It got a TV show, a novel, movies, souvenir shops, the whole treatment. Today it's probably the most famous highway in America, Route 66. 2 roads were born on the same day, out of the same government plan, chasing versions of the same dream, getting Americans across the country and into California. They ran roughly parallel across the southern half of the map, 2 competing answers to the same new American obsession. And here's what almost nobody tells you. For a long stretch of years, Fletcher's Road was not some obscure little alternative. It was promoted as the Southern year-round route, and there were years when traffic counts at the California line put it ahead of Route 66. During the Dust Bowl, it carried a major share of the westbound migration that popular memory later attached almost entirely to the Mother Road. And in 1927, the Federal Bureau of Public Roads said it was more surface throughout than any other transcontinental highway. It had a number same as 66. It was called 80, US Highway 80. And by 1991, after decades of retreat, a committee sat down in a room, decided the number wasn't needed anymore west of Dallas, and finished wiping it off the western half of the map. No ceremony, no song, nobody said goodbye. So here's the question you're going to sit with for the next hour. 2 roads, same birthday, same dream. One of them turns into a legend that people cross oceans to drive. The other gets so completely forgotten that its own country pulls the signs down and hardly anyone notices they're gone. How does that happen? How does the more important road become the one nobody remembers? The answer is the strangest thing about this whole story, and it has almost nothing to do with the road itself. To get there, you have to go back. Before the number, before that Cadillac, to 2 towns on opposite ends of the country that both wanted the same impossible thing and couldn't get it without each other. Now, if you saw our story on the Lincoln Highway or the one on Route 66, you already know what a mess American roads were back then. 250 different named trails, painted onto telephone poles, overlapping each other, contradicting each other, half of them barely roads at all. I'm not going to drag you through all that again. What matters here is one specific dream, held by people at two far corners of the map who never met. Start in Savannah, Georgia, right on the Atlantic. In the summer of 1914, the Automobile Club there sent a car out just to find out whether you could even get across the state of Georgia under your own power. That was the whole idea, at first, cross Georgia. But somewhere out on that drive, the ambition got bigger. The way ambitions do when there's nobody around to say no. Why stop at Georgia? Why not keep going? Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, and on until you hit the Pacific. They called it the Dixie Overland Highway. And their sales pitch was one word long: winter. Because the famous roads, the northern ones, the Lincoln Highway included, all had the same flaw. They climbed mountains, they crossed the high plains, and every year, for months at a stretch, the snow shut them down cold. The southern men looked at that weakness and saw their whole opportunity. Their road would run low and warm across the bottom of the country. Their road would be the one you could still drive in January. The shortest and only year-round ocean-to-ocean highway, they called it. Hold on to that phrase, year-round, because it runs all the way to the end of this story. And this was not two fellows with a paint can. By 1917, they'd incorporated the Dixie Overland Highway as a real outfit, headquartered in Columbus, Georgia, plotting a route across 8 states and something like 200 towns. There was pride buried in it too. The South had spent the 50 years since the Civil War as the poor corner of the country, the region the money and the momentum skipped right over. A great national highway of their own, one the North couldn't even match in winter, was a way of saying the South still counted, that the future would come through here too, and not just around. That's the eastern end of the dream. Now go to the other end, to the town that needed the road more than anybody: San Diego, California. It sits in the bottom corner of the country, shoved down against the Mexican border, and in 1914 it was watching Los Angeles, 100 miles up the coast, swell into a giant while San Diego stayed a town. Los Angeles had everything. It had the money, it had the railroads, and it had the one thing San Diego did not: a clean way east. If you wanted to drive out of San Diego toward the rest of America, you ran straight into a wall of mountains, and behind the mountains a desert, and out in the middle of that desert, the single worst obstacle of all, which we will get to, because honestly it's the best part. The man who could not live with this was Ed Fletcher, the same Ed Fletcher from the Cadillac, a land dealer, a promoter, the kind of man who is physically unable to leave a problem sitting there unsolved. And his fear was a simple one. He was sure that if San Diego didn't get itself a direct road east, and fast, Los Angeles was going to take everything there was to take, and San Diego was going to spend the next century as the city travelers skipped. Fletcher said it plainly himself, that the automobile could decide San Diego's whole future, if only the city could punch a road through to the east. He'd stood up in the hills above town and looked at the country between him and the rest of America, and flat refused to accept that geography got the final word. Most people thought a direct road east was impossible. Fletcher thought impossible was just a word other men used to explain why they'd quit trying. So when the Dixie Overland men were fighting over where to put the western end of their road, Los Angeles the safe pick, or San Diego the long shot, Fletcher fought like his city's life depended on it. In 1918, he and his allies talked the association into San Diego. He was going to hand that road its Pacific end personally, or wreck himself in the attempt. There was just the small problem of the mountains, and the desert and the thing out in the desert, because between San Diego and the rest of the United States lay a field of moving sand. The Imperial Sand Dunes, not sand like a beach, sand like an ocean, running in slow motion. Huge dunes, some of them hundreds of feet tall, that the wind shoved a little farther across the land every single day, burying anything that sat still long enough. You could not build an ordinary road across a thing like that. Men had tried. They'd lay a track down, come back a week later, and the track would be gone, buried, erased, like it had never been there at all. Somebody had even tried laying mats of arrowweed brush across the sand, figuring the desert's own plants might hold a road where nothing else would. The brush broke apart under the tires, and the wheels bogged down in the loose sand underneath, and that was the end of that. The engineers had a reasonable answer: go around it, swing the road the long way, over ground that held still. Fletcher would not hear of it. Going around cost San Diego miles, and the miles were the entire point. He was trying to pull his city closer to the east, not push it farther away. He wanted the road to run straight through the dunes. The short way, the impossible way. And since the desert would not hold a normal road, Ed Fletcher decided he'd build an abnormal one. He decided to lay a road across the moving sand out of wood. And in February of 1915, that is exactly what he did. Fletcher couldn't wait for the government to act, so he raised the money himself, something like $20,000. Most of it came out of San Diego, a few thousand more out of Yuma, just across the state line in Arizona, the two towns that stood to gain the most. He had the lumber hauled in by rail, 37 rail cars of it. And on February 13, 1915, crews went out into the dunes and started building the strangest highway in America. They finished 6 miles of it in about 3 weeks. 6 miles of road made out of boards. I want you to really picture what this was, because wooden road makes it sound sturdier than it was. It was 2 narrow tracks of plank, one for your left wheels and one for your right, each track only about 25 inches wide, nailed down on cross ties over the bare sand. That was it. 2 ribbons of wood, barely wider than the tires, running off across an ocean of dunes. You didn't drive down it so much as balance on it. Keep both sets of wheels up on the boards, and you were fine. Slip off, and one wheel dropped into soft sand, and the car lurched and stuck, and now you were out in the heat with a shovel. The planks warped in the sun. The whole road, one traveler said, humped up on one side and dropped down on the other and writhed along like a snake. And the wind never quit working against it, pushing sand up over the boards, so long stretches of the thing were always half buried and had to be dug out over and over. There was no room for 2 cars. So every mile or so they built a little turnout, a wider patch of planking, where one car could pull aside and let another squeeze past. Which meant that if you met somebody coming the other way between turnouts, one of you was backing up across the sand, on 2 ribbons of wood, in the middle of the desert. People who made that crossing did not forget it. You crept along at a walking pace, both hands locked on the wheel, watching the boards vanish under the hood, and praying the next one held your weight. In summer, the heat came up off the sand in sheets, and the water boiled in your radiator. If 2 cars met between turnouts and tempers went bad over who had to back up, that argument happened in 120 degrees with no shade for a day's ride in any direction. This was the front door to California. And for 11 years, the front door to California was 6 miles of lumber laid over a desert that was trying to eat it. And out there, in the worst of it, was a man named Bill Magee. Magee's whole job existed because this road was so bad. He lived out by the dunes, and for 7 years he worked them with a team of horses, and the work was rescue. He dragged the blown sand off the planks so cars could get through. And when a car wobbled off the boards and buried itself, which happened all the time, Magee would come with his horses and haul it back up onto the road. People who crossed those dunes remembered him for the rest of their lives. 6'2", never wore a hat, out there under a sun that could kill you. Face weathered like the ground itself. For a lot of travelers, Bill Magee and his horses were the only thing standing between them and real trouble on that sand. It's tempting to make that sound romantic, and I won't, because the road was genuinely deadly. By 1919, the Automobile Club of Southern California was openly warning people about it. Cars got wrecked out there, people got stranded. And stranded, in that country, in that heat, with no water and nobody coming, could mean dead. So they kept trying to fix it. In 1916, they replaced the 2 skinny tracks with a wider plank road, 8 feet across. In 1924, they built yet another version, but no version of it ever solved the actual problem, which was that the desert never once stopped moving. The sand blew over the boards day and night, so the road only existed as long as men kept uncovering it. Sit with that for a second. A federal highway, the front door to California, that would simply cease to exist within a few days if the crews ever stopped showing up to dig it back out of the sand. It wasn't really a road. It was a daily argument with the desert, and the desert never got tired. Wood and moving sand were never going to make peace, and eventually the engineers quit trying to beat the dunes and decided to outsmart them instead. In 1926, they laid down 6.5 miles of real asphalt, except they built it up high, on oiled sand embankments raised level with the smaller dunes, and they curved it around the giant ones, the monsters 200 and 300 feet tall. It cost $340,000, split down the middle between the state and the federal government. And it held. For the first time, there was a permanent road across the sand. Now here's the small, quiet thing that happens next, and I want you to catch it, because the whole rest of this story is hiding inside it. The good road put Bill Magee out of work. Once the asphalt went in, cars stopped wobbling off into the sand. Nobody needed a man with horses to haul them out anymore. The very thing Magee had spent 7 years of his life doing just stopped being necessary. And in 1928, 2 years after the permanent road opened, Bill Magee was killed in a car wreck near those same sand hills. The state's own Highway magazine ran a short notice about him, and it said something almost unbearable. It said the drifting sand would soon cover over whatever was left of the old plank road until there'd be nothing out there at all to show that Magee or his horses or any of it had ever been. The road becomes permanent at the exact moment the men who made it possible disappear. Remember the shape of that. You're going to see it again, a lot bigger, before we're through. Back to Fletcher. He'd spent more than a decade on this. The fundraising, the plank road, the political fights that came with both. All of it aimed at one thing, connecting San Diego to the rest of the country. And in October of 1926, he climbed into that Cadillac and made the run you already watched, 71 hours to Savannah, to prove to the whole nation that the Southern Road wasn't a fantasy anymore, that you could actually do it, coast to coast, across the bottom of America. And just a few weeks after he pulled into Savannah, the road he'd bled for finally got the one thing it had never had in all those years, a single number. On November 11, 1926, the United States adopted a whole new system for its roads. Out went the painted names on the telephone poles. In came numbers on little shield-shaped signs. And if you saw our Route 66 story, that date should stop you cold, because it is the exact same day, out of the exact same meeting, that a diagonal road up through Oklahoma got the number that would make it a legend. Route 66 was born on November 11, 1926. So was Highway 80. Same day, same system, same stroke of the pen. One of those numbers you've known your whole life. The other one you're meeting right now for the first time. US 80 was one of the original coast-to-coast routes. 2,726 miles of it, from San Diego on the Pacific to Savannah on the Atlantic, running through Yuma and Phoenix and Tucson, through El Paso and Fort Worth and Dallas, through Shreveport and Jackson and Selma and Montgomery, and down to the sea. A couple of years later, they pushed the eastern end a few miles farther, out to Tybee Island, Georgia, so the road would actually touch the Atlantic. It still ends there today. And like every early highway, 80 wasn't built from scratch so much as stitched together out of what was already lying there. It swallowed the Dixie Overland in the east. It took big pieces of a road called the Bankhead Highway across Texas in the southwest, and fragments of old Spanish trails and wagon roads out west. For years, a driver had needed to memorize half a dozen trail names to get across the country. Now he needed one number, 80. That was the quiet genius of the whole new system, and it's the exact reason the old names were doomed. A number is easier to follow. A number is also a great deal easier to forget. There's a story Fletcher liked to tell later, that his big Cadillac run was the thing that created US 80. And I'm going to do what this channel always does and give you the truth instead, because the truth is better. Fletcher's drive didn't create the number. The government had already penciled Highway 80 onto the map a year before he ever turned the key. What Fletcher actually did was harder than picking a number off a list. He spent 10 years making the western end physically possible, laying wood over sand that didn't want a road, and then he got in a car and proved the whole thing could be driven as a single trip. He didn't invent the road, he proved it was real. And here is the fact that everything else in this story bends around. In 1927, 1 year after Highway 80 got its number, the Federal Bureau of Public Roads wrote up an official description of it. They called it a year-round road. And then they said something I still can't quite get over. They said it was, and I'm quoting them here, more surface throughout than any other transcontinental highway. Sit with that. Out of every road that crossed the United States, the government's own engineers ran the numbers and said Highway 80 was the best surfaced of all of them. Not the most famous, the best built, the one you could actually rely on. The year-round road, the all-weather road. The road that didn't quit on you when the sky opened up. That's the road starting life in first place. Though I should tell you what best surfaced actually meant in 1927, because it isn't what you'd think. When the government measured Highway 80 that year, less than a third of it was truly paved. Barely 800 miles of brick and concrete out of more than 2,700. The rest was gravel, packed sand, clay, oiled dirt, and in a few stretches just graded earth with the ruts still in it. So Highway 80 was two things at the same time. It was the best transcontinental road in America, and it was still mostly unfinished. The best of a rough lot. A real highway and a promise nobody had kept yet, both riding in the same road. It would take years of work to close those gaps, but even half built, it was already out ahead of everything else on the map. So fix where we are right now. It's the late 1920s. Highway 80 is the best transcontinental road in America and the only one you can drive every month of the year. Route 66 up north is still mostly dirt. If somebody made you bet right then on which of these two roads history was going to remember, you would put your money on 80, and you would lose every cent of it. Because a number on a sign and some gravel on the ground is not what makes a road live in people's memory. People do that, and people were about to start building their whole lives along the shoulder of Highway 80. Because the way Highway 80 changed a town was simple, almost brutal. If the road came through your town, then every single person crossing that half of the country came right down your main street. And every one of them needed something: gas, a meal, a bed, a patched tire, a place to fix whatever had broken 200 miles back. A town on Highway 80 had a thing you could not buy and could not fake. It had a river of strangers with money in their pockets, forced to slow down and roll right past the front door. And a certain kind of person looked at that river and saw a whole life in it. His name was Marsh Zimicki. Everybody called him Zim. He'd been a mine worker, hard job, no future in it, and he ended up in a little town called Strawn, Texas, out where the Bankhead Corridor, the road that would become Highway 80, ran straight through. Strawn was nothing much. It never even cracked 1,500 people. But the road came through it, and Zim understood exactly what the road was worth. So starting back in the 1920s, Zim and his father-in-law started building. Not one business, a whole roadside world. A gas station first, then a cafe, then an ice house, because a family crossing Texas in July would pay good money for ice. Then a bottling plant, then tourist courts, little cabins so you could sleep there too. Billboards out on the highway telling you what was coming up. By the time Zim was done, a traveler could pull off Highway 80 into his place, fill the tank, eat a hot dinner, buy a cold drink, get the car looked at, and sleep the night, and never once leave his property. Remember Zim's place? Fix it in your mind, the gas pumps and the cafe and the row of little cabins, because we are going to come back to it twice, and the second time is going to sting. Zim wasn't special, that's the whole point. All the way down Highway 80, from Georgia to California, people were doing the same thing Zim did, betting their entire lives on the traffic, and the buildings they put up tell you everything about what was happening to the country. Go out to Van Horn, in far west Texas. There was a hotel there, the Clark Hotel, and when they built it facing the railroad tracks, because in the old world the railroad was where your customers came from. Then the automobile took over. Then Highway 80 came through town. And the owners did something you can still read in the bones of that building today. They moved the front door. They turned the whole entrance around to face the highway instead of the tracks. The entire shift, from an America that traveled by train to an America that traveled by car, is sitting right there in one building that turned its back on the railroad and put its face toward the road. By 1929, the Southern Highway had a nickname. It started down in El Paso, where boosters trying to reel in tourists and dollars began calling Highway 80 the Broadway of America. And the name caught. Towns up and down the line grabbed it. The Broadway of America. The great bright main street of the whole country, except it wasn't in any city. It was 2,000 miles of road running through the desert and the cotton land and the piney woods of the South. And for a while, the name actually fit. This was the road you took to get west, the bright commercial spine of the whole southern half of the country. If you ran a business anywhere near it, you wanted to be on Highway 80. Your motel wanted its sign facing Highway 80. The road was the thing that decided whether your town was on the way to somewhere or off in the weeds where nobody would ever find you. For 30 years, an enormous amount of American life got arranged around one simple question: does Highway 80 come through my front yard, or doesn't it? Now here's where I have to tell you about the rivalry, because I've been keeping it in my back pocket this whole time, and it's time. Every one of these years I'm describing, the good years, the Broadway years, there was another road doing the exact same thing a few states to the north. Route 66. Same era, same neon, same families pulling off for gas and a burger and a bed. Two roads, running parallel across the bottom of the country, both selling the same promise, which was California. Sunshine, a fresh start out west. And I need you to hear this part clearly, because it is the whole engine of the story. Highway 80 was not the little brother here. Highway 80 was not losing. Into the 1950s, there were years when the counters at the California state line clocked more cars crossing into the state on Highway 80 than on Route 66. the most famous highway in the world, and for a stretch of years the road nobody remembers was quietly out pulling it. Run that back in your head. More traffic, more people, more of the actual thing a road is for. And yet one of these two roads is about to become the most famous highway on Earth, sung about, filmed for television, printed on 10,000 postcards, sold back to you as a keychain. And the other one is the road you're watching this video to rediscover, because you'd never heard of it before tonight. Same dream, same decade, more cars on 80. So why does only one of them get to be a legend? Not yet. Hold it. Because for now, in the golden years, Highway 80 was booming, and the boom built a whole world you can still find pieces of. In Tucson, Arizona, the highway ran down a strip that filled with motels and neon and diners, so many of them that even today, after everything, that one stretch still has more than 280 old motels and roadside buildings standing on it. In Phoenix, whole rows of motor courts went up along the route through the 1930s and 40s. Little cabins with a pool and a sign glowing all night out front, all of it aimed at the headlights coming in off the desert after dark. After the Second World War, the whole country got in the car. The factories that had spent 4 years building tanks went back to building automobiles, and a generation that had come through a depression and a war wanted to go somewhere and enjoy it. The family road trip turned into the great American vacation, and the southern route, warm and wide open, pointed straight at California, filled right up with it. Picture driving it in its prime, say 1950, across the Arizona desert at night. The road is a thin string of lights pulled across 100 miles of black nothing. You drive an hour on empty dark, and then a town rises up out of it, a knot of motel signs buzzing in the heat, a cafe with the lights still on, a filling station where a man walks out and pumps your gas and tells you the next good stop is 90 miles on, so you'd best eat now. You didn't reserve anything. You drove till your eyes gave out and pulled in under whatever sign was still lit, and every one of those signs was somebody's entire life staked on a single bet that the headlights would keep coming over the horizon. And that's what Highway 80 had become. Not a promoter's dream anymore, not Fletcher's crusade. It had turned into somebody's motel, somebody's cafe, somebody's gas station, somebody's whole livelihood, thousands of times over, strung out along 2,000 miles of pavement. The road had become ordinary. And that is not an insult. That's the best thing that can happen to a road. It had become part of everyday American life. And once a road becomes part of everyday life, history starts happening on it, whether anybody planned it or not. The first thing history did with Highway 80 was fill it with the desperate. Through the 1930s, the southern plains dried up and turned to dust, and the families who had farmed that land loaded what they could onto trucks and worn-out cars and drove west, chasing a rumor of work in California. You know this migration, you've seen the photographs, and you know the road people remember it on, because John Steinbeck put Route 66 into the grapes of wrath and gave it a name that stuck forever, the Mother Road. But the migration was much bigger than any one highway. Highway 80 carried a major share of those westbound families too, the same overloaded trucks, the same everything they owned lashed down and rolling toward California. Route 66 got Steinbeck's immortal nickname. Highway 80 carried thousands of the same desperate travelers without ever receiving the same place in the national memory. And then 8 years after Highway 80 got its number, it turned up in the middle of the most famous manhunt in America. In May of 1934, the law was closing in on Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow. The posse hunting them had worked out that the couple was moving through the Highway 80 corridor, back and forth between Dallas and northern Louisiana. And near the town of Minden, on a detour off Highway 80, the officers got a jolt they never saw coming. They came around, and there were Bonnie and Clyde, driving straight at them, coming the other way. The lawmen kept their faces flat and did not react, because their trap was already set for the next morning, and if Bonnie and Clyde caught even a flicker of recognition, the whole thing would collapse. So they let them pass, drove on like it was nothing. And the next morning, May 23, 1934, on a quiet side road just off Highway 80 near Gibbsland, the posse opened fire, and it was over in seconds. 6 lawmen, more than 100 rounds, and the most wanted couple in America was gone. Highway 80 mattered to the story because it was one of the main arteries through that part of the country, the kind of road fugitives, police, salesmen, and ordinary families all used for the same reason. It connected the places they needed to reach. I'm not going to tell you their whole story because it isn't ours. The point is simpler. 8 years after getting its number, Highway 80 was already woven into one of the country's most famous crime stories. And 31 years later, the same road would become the stage for something far more consequential. Jump to 1965. Same road. Alabama this time. The stretch of Highway 80 that ran from Selma to Montgomery, the state capital. And the stakes could not have been higher, because Black Americans across the South were being kept from the ballot box by every trick and threat the system could invent, and in Selma they had decided to march to the Capitol and demand the vote. On March 7, 1965, around 600 marchers set out from Selma, heading east, and the way east was Highway 80. They came up over a bridge at the edge of town, the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and on the far side of it, waiting for them on the highway, stood a line of state troopers. What happened next happened on Highway 80. The troopers charged into the marchers with clubs and tear gas and drove them back across the bridge, and the cameras were rolling, and the film went out to the whole country that night. They called it Bloody Sunday, and America saw it. They tried again. And this time, after a federal judge affirmed their right to walk, they went the whole distance. On March 21st, thousands set out from Selma along Highway 80 toward Montgomery, where the highway pinched down to 2 lanes through Lowndes County. A court order held the marching column to 300 people, and those 300 walked, for days. Down the shoulder of Highway 80, past the fields, camping at night in the mud beside the road, getting up in the morning and walking again, mile after mile of federal highway under their feet. When they reached Montgomery on March 25th, the 300 had grown to tens of thousands, and the pressure from that walk, on that road, helped drive the Voting Rights Act through Congress that same year, one of the handful of laws that genuinely changed the country. And before the consequences of that march were finished, Highway 80 became the scene of another killing. On the night the march reached Montgomery, Viola Liuzzo, a mother from Detroit who had driven south to help, was ferrying marchers back towards Selma when Klansmen pulled alongside her car on Highway 80 and shot her dead behind the wheel. For those days in March, this stretch of Highway 80 became one of the most closely watched roads in America. Reporters lined the route. Television cameras carried the violence and the march into homes across the country. A federal highway through the Alabama Black Belt had become part of a national fight over whether millions of Americans would be allowed to vote. Keep your eye on the pavement through all of it. The bridge, the shoulder, the center line, the campsites in the dark. This history did not merely happen near Highway 80. It happened on it. So look at what this road had become. It was tied to one of America's most famous crime stories. It carried the Selma-to-Montgomery March. At points in its history, traffic counts on the Southern California approach rivaled or exceeded Route 66. And in its first years, federal highway officials described it as more fully surfaced than any other transcontinental route. If historical importance alone created legends, Highway 80 should have been impossible to forget. Hold that thought. Because at the very moment Highway 80 was earning its deepest place in American history, out on that Alabama pavement in 1965, another state, 1,000 miles to the west, had already quietly begun taking the road down. That state was California, and the thing replacing Highway 80 was not a villain. I want to be straight with you about that, the same way I was in the Route 66 story, because the easy version of this is a lie. The easy version says the interstate came and murdered the old road out of greed or stupidity. That's not what happened. What happened is that America got better at building highways. After the war, the country started laying down the interstate system, and those new roads were genuinely enormously better. Divided lanes, so you weren't playing chicken with an oncoming truck. No stoplights, no main streets to crawl through at 15 miles an hour, no wobbling off into the sand. You got on, and you moved 70 miles an hour for hundreds of miles at a stretch. If you were driving coast to coast, the interstate was a gift, and that is exactly what killed the old road. Not that the new one was worse, that it was better. Being better was the whole problem. Route 66 was replaced by several interstates, but by far its longest single replacement corridor was I-40, which is part of why its western story stayed relatively easy to follow. Highway 80 didn't even get that. Highway 80's corridor got carved up and parceled out to 4 different interstates. I-8 out in the California and Arizona desert, I-10 across the Southwest, I-20 through Texas, I-30 coming into Dallas. The old road never got one clear air it could hand its identity to. It got scattered across 4 numbers, and nobody scatters into a legend. Down on the ground, in the towns, the scattering felt like a death. Remember Zim? Remember Strawn, Texas, the gas station and the cafe and the row of cabins Zim built up over 30 years? In the 1970s, Interstate 20 bypassed Strawn. That's all it took. One new road, a couple of miles south, And the river of traffic that Zim's whole world was built on simply moved. It didn't slow down, it didn't die, it just went somewhere else, out onto the interstate, where there was no reason on earth to exit for a little town nobody had heard of. Zim's real advantage had never been the quality of his cafe or the price of his ice. His advantage was location, on a road you could not avoid. And the second the traffic got a way to avoid it, that advantage was worth nothing, and it could not move. The buildings couldn't pick themselves up and chase the cars. They just sat there on the old road, going quiet. And it wasn't only Strawn. A few miles off, I-20 bypassed the town of Baird the same way. And on it went, up and down the corridor, town after town, the traffic peeling off onto the new road and the old main street going still. This wasn't a tragedy that happened once. It was the whole road, all at once, over about 20 years. And remember Van Horn, out in West Texas, and the Clark Hotel that had turned its front door around to face Highway 80. In 1975, the interstate bypassed Van Horn. So the hotel that had physically rebuilt itself to face the road was now facing a road the traffic had walked out on. It had bet on the highway twice, once when it turned its back on the railroad, and again every year it stayed open. And it lost the second bet, the same way the railroad had lost the first one. The direction of American travel had shifted again, and this time the building was pointed the wrong way for good, and buildings can't turn around twice. But here is where Highway 80's story splits off from every other bypassed road you have ever heard of. Because losing your traffic to the interstate is the normal kind of death. Every old road went through that. Route 66 went through that. What happened to Highway 80 next did not happen to Route 66, and it's the reason you and I are here. The number itself started to disappear. Not the pavement, the name. State by state, Highway 80 began vanishing off the map of America. And once you see how it went, you'll understand why nobody mourned it, and why almost nobody even noticed. It started in California, in 1964. The state was reorganizing its highway numbering system around the new interstate era, and in 1964 California asked to have its section of US 80 removed from the official US highway system. Granted. Piece by piece, through the 1960s and into the 70s, the shields came down, until Highway 80 didn't exist in California at all. Stop and feel where that blow landed. San Diego, Fletcher City, the whole reason any of this ever happened. The plank road, the fundraising, the horses in the river, the 71 hours in the Cadillac, every bit of it was to give San Diego a road east. And now San Diego was the first place to lose it. The very first stretch of Highway 80 to be erased was the stretch Ed Fletcher had fought his entire life to build. The corridor was still there. The cars were still crossing the dunes. But now it was Interstate 8, and the name Fletcher bled for was simply gone. He wasn't alive to see it. Small mercy. Then it kept going, the way an amputation keeps going. In 1977, Arizona took the next piece, pulling US 80 from the California line east to a town called Benson. The road shrank again. In 1989, Arizona and New Mexico together pulled the next stretch, from Benson over to Anthony, right on the Texas line. And with that, the official length of Highway 80 dropped to 1,706 miles. A road born at 2,700 miles had lost 1,000 miles of its own self, one committee meeting at a time. Watch it happen on a map, and it's almost eerie. In 1926, one bold line runs unbroken from the Pacific at San Diego to the Atlantic at Savannah, the entire bottom of the country tied together with a single number. Then California erases, and the western tip of the line pulls back off the coast. Then Arizona erases, and the line shrinks east across the desert. Then New Mexico and the far edge of Texas erase, and the whole western end comes reeling back toward the middle of the map. The road is retreating across the continent in slow motion, like a tide going out. And here's the thing you have to keep reminding yourself. It isn't the pavement pulling back. The cars are all still out there, more of them every year. It's only the number retreating. The name sliding east across America a few hundred miles at a time until there's hardly any of it left. And then, in 1991, they finished it. New Mexico and Texas asked to strip US 80 from Anthony all the way to Dallas. And listen to the reason, because the reason is the most important part. There was no drama in it at all. Nobody said the road was bad. Nobody said it had failed. The argument was that Highway 80 out there now ran right on top of Interstate 10, Interstate 20, and Interstate 30. So that whole stretch of country already had its numbers. Keeping the old 80 shields up next to them just confused drivers and cost money to maintain. 2 numbers for one corridor. Wasteful. On October 12, 1991, the request was approved. Highway 80 west of Dallas ceased to exist as a U.S. route, and Dallas became the western end of a road that had once touched the Pacific. No ceremony, no last drive, no crowd in the street like the one that waited on Fletcher in Shreveport at 1 in the morning. The remaining western designation simply disappeared into the newer highway system. And think about what that looked like on the ground. There was no last man driving the final mile of Highway 80 into the sunset. Somewhere, road crews received work orders. Old shields came down where newer route numbers already did the work. A driver in El Paso could watch an 80 sign disappear while interstate signs still pointed him exactly where he needed to go. That is how this coast-to-coast highway ended in the West. Not with a bang, but with paperwork. Now compare that with Route 66. Route 66 was bypassed gradually too, town by town, over decades. But it eventually received something Highway 80 never did, one nationally recognized final date. In June of 1985, the last official US 66 designation was removed. That gave preservationists a clean ending to point to. And by then, the road already possessed an identity much larger than its pavement. It had Steinbeck's Mother Road, it had Bobby Troupe's song. It had television, postcards, roadside imagery, and decades of family memories. So when the official road finally disappeared, millions of people already knew exactly what the words Route 66 meant. Highway 80 disappeared differently. California removed it, then Arizona, then New Mexico, then Western Texas. Its old job was divided among I-8, I-10, I-20, and I-30, while the eastern half of Highway 80 stayed alive. There was no single corpse, no single successor, and no clean moment when the whole country could look at a map and say, that's the road we just lost. And that matters, because preservation needs both an object and a story. Route 66 had both. Its clear identity gave people something to organize around, something to mark, restore, and eventually sell back to later generations as an experience. Highway 80 had fragments under different numbers, and an identity that had already been fading for decades before most Americans realized there was anything to save. The song mattered, Steinbeck mattered, television mattered, that final national decommissioning mattered. And once Route 66 became the road people remembered, the memory fed on itself. Tourists came because it was famous. Businesses survived or were restored because tourists came. Every restored motel and every new historic sign made the legend stronger. Highway 80 fell into the opposite loop. The name faded, fewer people went looking for it, less of its roadside world was preserved specifically as Highway 80, and every lost piece made the road harder to remember as one thing. So the answer is not that Route 66 mattered and Highway 80 didn't, and it isn't that one song magically saved a highway. Route 66 built one coherent story strong enough to outlive its official road. Highway 80 was being divided into pieces before a comparable story ever hardened around the name. A song is one way a road cheats death. But first, people have to know which road they're singing about. But before you feel too sorry for old Highway 80, there's one more thing you need to know. Because unlike Route 66, Highway 80 pulled off something quietly astonishing. It refused to die. Here's what almost nobody realizes. US 80 still exists, right now, today. Everything I just told you about, the erasing, the shrinking, the committee in 1991, all of that was only the western half. East of Dallas, Highway 80 never went anywhere. It's still a working federal highway, running east out of Dallas through Louisiana, through Mississippi, through Alabama, right past Selma, on through Georgia, out to Tybee Island where it touches the Atlantic in the exact spot it always did. The dead Transcontinental Highway is a living road whose western half just lost its name. You could get in your car today and follow US 80 all the way from Dallas to the Atlantic on actual Highway 80 signs, and never suspect that the road once continued another 1,000+ miles west towards San Diego. And west of Dallas, where the name was erased, the road is still out there too. You just have to know how to see it. It didn't vanish, it changed clothes. Go west from Dallas, and old Highway 80 starts appearing in fragments. In Strawn, Zim's roadside complex still stands beside the old corridor, the cafe and tourist courts quietly recording the kind of roadside economy that once depended on every passing car. Zim's was never a national attraction. That is exactly why it matters. It was an ordinary man's ordinary bet that the traffic would keep coming. Farther west, in California's Imperial Sand Dunes, pieces of the old plank road still survive. Warped boards resting in the same sand that crews once fought every day to keep off the highway. Bill Magee's road, Fletcher's road, the impossible crossing that helped make the whole western end possible. Elsewhere, Old US 80 reappears as a business loop, a state highway, a frontage road, or an ordinary local street running beside the interstate that replaced its number. That's what makes Highway 80 so strange to chase today. Its remains are not gathered around one clean historic road. They're scattered across different jurisdictions and different names. The road is still there in pieces. The identity is what you have to reconstruct. Hello, it's Dale here. You're not done yet, but let me interrupt for just a few seconds. If you enjoy Backroads and want to help us keep making these videos, please consider supporting the channel by scanning the QR code on your screen or using the link below. Even $5 or $10 really helps us keep finding these places, researching their stories, and bringing them to you. If you can help, we'd truly appreciate it. Backroads only keeps going because of viewers like you. Thank you. God bless you. And now, back to the video. And then there's the last irony, the one that ties the whole thing in a knot. In 2006, the state of California, the very first state to erase US 80, the state that started the whole amputation back in 1964, turned around and officially named its old stretch of the road Historic US Route 80. The state that killed the number was the first one to put it back up on signs as history. Don't mistake that for a resurrection, because it isn't one, and this channel doesn't do fake comebacks. A historic sign is not the road coming back to life. The old Transcontinental Highway 80 is not returning. What that sign really means is smaller and sadder and truer than a comeback. It means a country deciding to hang a little plaque on the thing it spent 30 years calling redundant, to treat as heritage the exact road it couldn't wait to erase. And over in Alabama, on the stretch that never died, Highway 80 carries two identities at once now. It's still an ordinary working road, people driving to work on it, trucks hauling freight down it. And it's also, officially, the Selma-to-Montgomery National Historic Trail, protected ground, the rot of the march. One road, ordinary infrastructure, and sacred memory, the same pavement, at the same time. So let me bring you back, one last time, to Ed Fletcher. He stood in the mountains east of San Diego before any of this, and looked at a wall of rock in a desert full of moving sand and imagined a road that everyone around him swore could not exist. Then he went and made it exist. He talked a city into paying for it. He laid wood across sand that swallowed roads whole. He put 4 horses in a river to drag a Cadillac across. He drove 71 hours without really sleeping to prove to the whole country it was real. And America looked at what he'd built and agreed with him and gave the corridor a number, 80. And then America did the thing Fletcher never could have seen coming. It believed in his idea so completely that it built 4 bigger, faster, better roads right on top of his dream. And once it had them, it reached down and quietly took his number back. The road is still there. That's the part that gets me. You have almost certainly driven a piece of Highway 80 without the faintest idea you were doing it. A lane of Interstate 10 out in the Arizona desert. Easier. A business rot through some Texas town. A 2-lane frontage road running quiet alongside the freeway. A gray plank half buried in a dune. The traffic Fletcher fought for never left. It's still pouring across the bottom of the country. More of it than he ever dreamed. The only thing that ever left was the name. If you grew up on a piece of the old 80, or on any road that lost its number when the interstate came through, I want to hear about it. Put it in the comments. Those are the stories this whole channel exists for, and I read of them. And if you've come this far with me, you already know what we do here. The roads that got left behind, and the towns that held on anyway, so subscribe and ride along for the next one. Because Route 66 did not survive on fame alone. It survived because its name stayed whole long enough for people to attach stories, music, memory, and eventually preservation to it. Highway 80 was divided before that could happen. The corridor stayed useful, the traffic stayed. The pavement survived in fragments. What disappeared was the single identity that had once connected all of it from one ocean to the other. Highway 80 had almost everything a great American road could earn. What it never kept was one coherent identity strong enough to outlive the number. It just never got the one thing that turns a road into a legend instead of a memory. Somebody to tell you it was there.